مساء الخير. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sari Hanafi. I'm professor of sociology at the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies, and the director of Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm so honored in the name of this center, but also the Muhammad Atallah Chair of Ethics. We have with us Bacharach and the other portal, but also the Institut Français de Proche-Orient, IFPO. On the name of this organization, I'm so glad that we are in the 8th session of our series, Retrospectives of the Arab Academics and Intellectuals. It's really specifically this time, I'm so honored to have with us Suad Joseph. Not only because she came from so far, not only United States, but California, Davis, but also because of her scholarship. I discovered her scholarship in 2005 with your amazing article that I kept for a long time, teach it in SOAN Introduction to Sociology. It's called Sister, Brother and Sister, about connectivity, love, and power. And I think in the framework of Arab patriarchal, I think it was still so timely, this kind of reflection about a topic that you complain in 90s that not much work have been done. And I would say, until today, it's really this relation between sister and the brother is under studies. So she, as you know, the series, it's a long series. You will bear with us because really we are very interested of communicate between two different generations. I mean, a generation where if you like, of 70s, not 1970s, but in their 70s, and sometimes late 60s, and the other generation. To reflect on trajectory. So the first part of our series is two discussants. So honored to have my friend Livia Wake and other friend Zina Sawaf. They will talk as well. So and then we will have a coffee break followed by the keynote of Suad Joseph on critical pathways engaging Arab families and selving. So let me briefly go through a little bit of bio. Suad Joseph is distinguished research professor at University of California, Davis. She's founder and the founding president of the Middle East Research Group in Anthropology. Also founder and founding president of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, founder and director of Arab Families Working Group. She founded and directed the University of California, Davis Arab Region Consortium, including which include AUB, AUC, LAU, University of Birzeit, University of Sharjah, and UC Davis. She's president of the MESA, Middle East Studies Association in North America, in 2010 and 2011. I go thoroughly on this because really it's amazing how she is scientific community builders. I mean, really, I mean, I don't know how, Suad, you do thorough research, but you are so generous of constituting all these networks and associations and organizing the Arab community abroad and here. And really, this is absolutely so missing I from my terminal in sociology, I know how weak the institutionalization and the professionalization of scientific communities in social science. So I will be brief to remind you just some of her work, the Arab Family Studies, Critical Review, a book published in 2018, and the award winner, Arab American Woman Representation and Refusal in 2021. Also, the Politics of Engaged Gender Research in 2020, a handbook of Middle Eastern women, also last year, and so on. And then, so glad to have again Livia, an associate professor of anthropology in our department, and UB. She grew up in Ramallah. Did you remember when I came have a dinner in your home? Yeah. And in Ramallah, I still remember. So a lady, and this is the first time where I tasted guacamole from your dad, and since then I do guacamole. so it's amazing. I mean, Livia in that time, she speak fluently Palestinians. I would say I don't speak fluently Palestinian. It's just disrupted by my Syrian accent, as I grew up as a Palestinian refugee in Syria. So she earned her BA from Brown University, her MA from Languedoc in Paris, and her PhD from MIT. She worked at UB since 2007, and her research and teaching lies in the overlapping themes of health, illness, birth, gender, and oral history. I would like really to congratulate you for your book, which just out, Smooth Birth, Oral Histories and Persistence in Palestine. It just came out in Syracuse University Press. And hopefully to have a book launching here or elsewhere. I'm sure many, public health are interested. SUAM, CAMES, maybe Al-Asfari. So I think it's a cross-cutting theme. And then another friend, Zina Sawaf, I got to know you when you was an intern, doing your intern at IFI, you remember? Many years ago. You are assistant professor of interdisciplinary gender studies at LEU, and your research and teaching go around anthropology, gender studies, and Gulf studies. You write and you publish in ethnographic practice in the Arab region, divorce, and the state of Saudi Arabia. And her book, our book project, hopefully soon we will have it, Encountering the State, Women and Intimate Lives in Ramallah. In Riyadh, sorry. And apparently it was read by MBS why he ordered the woman to allowed women to drive. So thank you for this. No. Okay, so with this note, I give the floor now to Livia Wick.
I'm going to stand up and yes. Okay. Marhaba, ahla wa sahla fikum. Welcome to those of you here, those of you online. Welcome all of you. It's an honor for me to be commenting on Professor Suad Joseph's trajectory and contribution. I know Suad Joseph as a colleague who visited Beirut on a regular basis for many years since I've been here, and supported me and other colleagues at Lebanese University. And then more recently, in the past 5 years, I've collaborated with her and 15 other colleagues on a large multi-sided research project that she coordinates about gender and STEM education. In this talk, I'm going to focus on her earlier work. In the past few weeks, I have been reading and rereading her work, and it's been thoroughly joyful to do that. My talk today has 5 points. 1, Joseph did not go out to study gender. Gender came to her. 2, her mode of observing and analyzing sociality, gender, and the state, which are threads woven through her work, builds on her experience of living in multiple worlds. 3, she uses the technique of rereading her initial fieldwork and the importance, I'm going to talk a bit about the importance of this analytic mode. 4, her concepts, such as patriarchal connectivity and others, have a life of their own. And 5, I want to say a word about the work of friendship and love. So 1, Joseph did not go out to study gender. Gender came to her. Joseph's corpus of written work begins in 1969 with a paper entitled Pluralism, a Tool of Imperialism. And then with her PhD at Columbia University in 1975, was published in chapters, in books, and in articles, notably in American Ethnologist article in 1983. She wrote about neighborly relationships between all sects in Bush Hammoud. She focused on working class networks that sustained the inhabitants of the neighborhood in the context of a sectarian state. She was interested in the concept of religion, class, and sectarianism. She conducted fieldwork between 1971 and 1973. Her main interlocutors were women because they were present at home where Joseph visited them. They wanted to talk, and they were invested in neighborly relations. They were doing the everyday work of sustaining neighborly relations and upkeeping the neighborhood networks. Thus, Joseph didn't go out to the field to study women or gender. Gender came to her. By the time Joseph went back to the United States after her fieldwork, feminism had reached the academy, and there were feminist reading groups and publication. And this began the process of giving a language to what Joseph was observing. 2, her mode of observing and analyzing sociology, gender, and the state, which are threads woven through her work, builds on her experience living in multiple worlds. It is clear in a number of Joseph's writings that her in-depth exploration of types of sociality had to do with her growing up and living in many worlds. She was born in Salim, a village above Jalidib and below Brahmana. Her father tended his orchards. Her mother was a homemaker. In preparation for this commentary, I discovered a beautiful little piece she wrote entitled Eyes of Indirection. It's in an edited book entitled Remembering Childhood in the Middle East, edited by Elizabeth Vernea. In this piece, Joseph remembers herself as a 6-year-old in Salim. The work of children was to observe, to speak, quote, with the language of eyes. She learned to observe without articulated voice direction from adults. She learned from her mother and older sister to communicate through indirection. She was reminded that others were always watching. It taught her how to ask without asking and to observe deeply. In that piece, she discusses her relationship with this is an aside, with fruit trees, and it's a lifelong relationship. So these were the snippets of the worlds of her, these were snippets of the worlds of her early childhood. Joseph grew up in many worlds. In 1949, at the age of 7, Joseph's family relocated to a small town in upstate New York called Cortland, where relatives had emigrated earlier on in the century. Her father worked as an unskilled laborer in a wire factory. Her mother worked as a skilled laborer in a corset factory. Her mother did piecework for a sweatshop, sewing bras and corsets and slips. The clothes had tags on them, 9 cents, 13 cents, 17 cents, and her mother would save the tags. At the end of the week, she added up the amounts on the tags, and that was her salary. Her mother and father raised Suad and her 6 siblings in Cortland, New York, educating them in public schools and public free universities. These were snippets of the worlds of her teens and university years. Being part of many worlds in her scholarship, being part of many worlds is in her scholarship and her analyses. After her graduate training at the University of Pittsburgh and then at Columbia University, she did fieldwork in Bush Hamoud, I said in 1971 to 1973. She writes that the types of sociality she was living and observing on the field were familiar to her, and that she was seeing what she was seeing because of the ways she lived multiple realities. And this feeling of familiarity, as well as the data or what she was observing and listening, challenged the notions of self that she had been schooled with and taught about. So when she went back to Columbia to write her dissertation, she began working on gender, the state, and notions of the self. And this work is published 2 decades later. Last week, I met Joseph for breakfast, and I asked about her experience of migration as living multiple worlds and the ways it shaped her attention to the self and its relationship to the state. Joseph noted the fact that her and her siblings' trajectory upwards through class structures in the United States was also a way in which she experienced living multiple worlds. She added that her mother was the motor for her children's ascendance, but that she, her mother, was unable to understand the upward trajectory that she herself had constructed. Joseph said, quote, "My mother was the visionary, but she could not encompass what she had achieved. She knew her children were successful, but could not understand the success. My mother could not know my experience, and we, her children, couldn't communicate our experiences, our lives. Language failed and culture failed. In a way, we had outgrown our world of the working class. We had no guides. We were living outside the culture we had been socialized into." Quote. The rise through class ranks was also a migration through language. Thus, Joseph's experiences with migration and with trans-class movement and her reflections on the ways these shaped her, her mother, and their relationship sparked continued attention to the construction of the self and family relation. 3, she uses the technique of rereading her initial fieldwork and the importance of this analytic mode. The questions about relationships and kinship were embedded in her thesis, and it took 2 decades before she published this work. She notes this in her piece reflecting on her scholarship in Ethnologie Française that came out recently in 2021. During this period, she was publishing other things, and at the same time grappling with connectivity, with thinking about the self and the family and the state. When I asked Joseph about it at our breakfast last week, she said that she didn't have the language yet when she was writing her PhD, that she had not articulated her research as being about the family, the state, and the self. This may be one explanation, but reading her earliest work about the sectarian state, neighborhood networks, and Wasta, and then her work a decade and a half later about brother-sister relationships and brother-brother relationships, made me reflect on modes of analyses of anthropological research that's visible through her writing and trajectory. First of all, the ways in which, with time, there's a way that data settles, finds its place in the stories and analyses of that the anthropologist is constructing. Maybe it's a bit of a traditional way of thinking about anthropological data, but it was part of my reading of her trajectory of writing. And second of all, I want to note that it's the same fieldwork material, the same group of interlocutors in both sets of work. The earliest work about networks, class, sectarianism, wasta, and the works, and the works in the mid-1990s about the family, Selving, and the state. But what she does in the brother-sister relationships and brother-brother relationships analyses is a rereading, rewriting, reinterpreting of the same fieldwork. And this made me think how important rereading and reinterpreting is to the practice of writing anthropological texts. And I want to add to this is a bit of an aside, but the 2 decades between her fieldwork, 1971 to 73, and the publication of her work about kinship were those decades of the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, the work about family starts coming out, culminating with her intimate selving in Arab families. And I asked myself how the Civil War is connected to the writing and the rewriting of the stories and to the ways, to the timing of these works. 4, Joseph's concepts have a life of their own. Joseph developed a language and a set of concepts with which to analyze family, gender, and the state in the Middle East. Since her very early work, she analyzes how state failure and weakness is connected to the importance of family networks and how people have to negotiate social services, both outside and through the state. The family, natal, and a final through marriage are the person's sources of security. For Joseph, families are one of the most important social structures of the Arab world. And she develops a language and concepts to analyzing it, including relationality, connective self, kin contract, care control paradigm, relational desire, and other. Joseph proposes the term patriarchal connectivity to describe the interplay of gender, selves, and identity in families in Lebanon. Patriarchal connectivity is a system that produces selves with, quote, fluid boundaries organized for gendered and age domination in a culture that valorizes kin structures, morality, and idioms, unquote. She sees people as entrenched in these relationships that shape their deepest sense of self. I have seen her concept of patriarchal connectivity take a life of its own in my undergraduate classroom, when we read her work, in my own work, in the work of colleagues. I wanted to note here the beautiful MA thesis in our program in anthropology at AUB by Rabia Hajej, entitled Intimate Allies, Familial Becomings in Beirut. He defended it recently. He was supervised by Sylvain Perdichon. In the thesis, he builds on patriarchal connectivity. He explores relationships between families and their queer kin in and around Beirut. He focuses on those families that have fostered the emergence of supportive family members. And he analyzes what becoming an ally to queer kin entails and what forms of support these family members provide. In his attention to communication, use of language, and acts of day-to-day support, Hajej brings out the ambiguities and discursive manipulations that are part of brother-sister and brother-brother relationships. Thus, Joseph's concepts take on lives of their own in the writings of students and anthropology. My last point is a word on the work of friendship and love. Joseph's work is in her writings, in her teaching and mentoring, in her institution building. Her work for me is in her modes of seeing and analyzing. But there is a type of work which I have not mentioned yet, and I have witnessed and experienced as a colleague, and then more recently as a collaborator. Indeed, her mode of producing scholarship is through the everyday work of constructing friendships and loving her colleagues. And I cherish and learn from that.
Thank you so much, Livia. And we move to Zina, and then you have you work with the man. You're opening the floor for discussion for all.
Thank you. Thank you, Sari. It really is. Thank you, Olivia, for that beautifully written. It was really nice to listen to you speak. It is both a great honor and pleasure to be here this evening to discuss the work and legacy of the Arab intellectual and academic Professor Suad Joseph. I dare say Suad Joseph is a household name. And that's because in my household, my 5-year-old is well aware that when I sit down on my computer for an online meeting at the end of the day when it is dark outside, this coincides with the early morning in California to meet with Professor Suad Joseph. When the world came to a halt during the COVID-19 pandemic and various corners of the world found themselves in lockdown, and academic meetings, projects, and conferences slowed down, and women in this part of the world and elsewhere reported shouldering the increasing household work and work of care, Suad Joseph was regularly bringing together 6 collaborators, I'm one of them, and 6 graduate researchers based around the region and the US online under the umbrella of the UC Davis Arab Consortium that she founded in 2001. The consortium gathers the UC Davis and 5 Arab region universities, including the Lebanese American University, AUB, American University in Cairo, Birzeit University, and American University of Sharjah to foster and facilitate partnerships among scholars, as well as collaborative research and training projects across discipline. Our team has been meeting almost weekly since 2020 to map the production of knowledge on women and gender in the Arab region from 1970 until the present. We presented our work a couple of days ago. This project aims to identify and critically review all the work that has been published on women and gender, including what topics were researched, who carried out the research, on what countries, using what theories and methods, published in what languages, and what finding. This project mobilized 3 generations of scholars from various disciplines, including English literature, gender studies, anthropology, geography, and media studies in the US and our region. More importantly, this project characterizes Suad Joseph's feminist and relational approach to knowledge production. Her approach does not shy away from asking large political questions, and her approach necessarily entails interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and transnational collaboration and engagement. This evening, I focus precisely on this kind of work, the work of inventing, creating, naming, and institutionalizing that Joseph has been engaged in since the 1970s, and which paralleled and overlapped with her strictly conceptual and intellectual work. Joseph's institutional building has been driven by 2 understandings. Firstly, her understanding that knowledge production unprotected by institutions can have a short life, fail, or be erased. In order to be visible, to survive, and to endure, institutions are essential for knowledge. Institutions open doors, generate opportunities, and enable sustainability beyond the individuals who build them. Joseph understood that none of the work of producing contextualized knowledge could be done alone. Secondly, and more crucially, her institutional building has been informed and shaped by her personal, political, and intellectual understanding of the self, not as bounded, autonomous, contractual, and selfish, but rather as deeply relational and nested in families. Most of her institutional building emerges from the concept of the individual self in the United States that she was never able to inhabit, until she not only started to theorize the self as relational, but also, and importantly, until she started to build networks and communities for knowledge production around that relational self. In other words, family did not only inform Joseph's theorization of the self and connectivity, but it also compelled her to build similarly enduring structures around knowledge production. Family did not only serve as a powerful idiomatic and analytical paradigm for her theories, but it also served as a structure or a way of relating around knowledge production. Joseph has not only been theorizing the Arab family for over 50 years, this evening I want to propose that she has also been building transnational intellectual and academic families as institutions. These institutions have made their mark on several disciplines, including anthropology, Middle East studies, and gender and women's studies. Her name, articles, and books populate and color dozens of syllabi in these disciplines around the world. In her own words, she was cooking in a cauldron, inventing fields, building networks and organizations, learning to think about institutions, and learning to institutionalize that thinking. So to go back to when she was doing graduate school in Pittsburgh and later in Columbia, at Columbia University, in the late 60s, early 70s, neither university had a Middle East anthropologist, nor did they offer courses in Middle East anthropology at the time. She found herself alone in those disciplines. In New York City, a number of other graduate students from Columbia and NYU were doing research in the Arab region. After she completed fieldwork in Burj Hamoud, which Livia discussed, she invited these students into a Middle East reading group to meet regularly at her apartment located at the borderline of Harlem. It was out of this reading group that Joseph invented the name Middle East Research Group in Anthropology and affiliated it with the AAA, the American Anthropological Association, becoming its first president. This group eventually became the Middle East section of the AAA that exists until today. Soon after, she joined the UC Davis Faculty of Anthropology, and she was the only faculty member who taught courses on the Middle East as part of her regular teaching load. Until as recently as 2001, she was the only faculty at UC Davis who regularly taught Middle East courses. Now, all of that changed, of course, after 9/11, when UC Davis hired 3 scholars of the Middle East. And of course, Joseph invited the reading group, which met at her home monthly and later on campus. And this reading group became the Middle East South Asia Studies Program, with Joseph as the director, founding director. Now this program features 1 major, 4 minors, 40 affiliated faculty, over 120 courses on the Middle East and South Asia, and endowments for Iranian, Arab, and South Asian studies. The program also raised funding for and introduced programs in Arabic, Hindi, Urdu, Persian, and Punjabi. Now let's backtrack a bit to the 1980s, when Joseph felt quite lonely in the field of Middle East studies, or as a feminist in Middle East studies, I would say. She felt compelled both by a historical moment and a vacuum, as well as the need of like-minded fellows, to marry women's studies and Middle East studies, and in order to bring, in her own words, sanity to scholarship. So she tried to bring women's studies to the Middle East Studies Association, MESA, by mobilizing feminist scholars and organizing numerous panels at MESA's meetings in 84 and 85. At the 85 MESA meeting in New Orleans, the Association for Middle East Women's Studies was founded. With herself and others. And she was founding president of AMEWS. She also later co-founded AMEWS' journal, which you might be all familiar with, the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, which is the most important and relevant interdisciplinary journal in our field today. It counts contributions by academics, artists, and activists from around the globe working on our region in the interpretive social sciences and humanities. So with all these experiences from the 70s and 80s in institution building, Joseph thus began what I would call her signature undertakings: bold, long-term, interdisciplinary, transnational, collective research endeavors. In 1988, she launched with other feminist scholars the Encyclopedia of Women and Islamic Cultures as general editor. Over 2 decades, the encyclopedia published approximately 1,500 articles by nearly 1,200 authors from around the world. Soon after, she founded the Arab Families Working Group out of a double sense of urgency, both intellectual and activist, at a time when Arab families were highly under-theorized and largely ignored by academic literature. The collective of 15 scholars co-housed at the American University in Cairo and UC Davis was concerned that mainstream gender analyses largely conceived of the family in opposition to an individualized woman subject struggling to assert her rights against family oppression. So this working group aimed to conceptually bring family and gender in dialogue. As Joseph writes, there is not one single event unfolding in our region that is not relevant to families, and for which more rigorous analyses of families could not produce an important and critical insight. The Arab Families Working Group developed an impressive assortment of publications. It generated 4 bibliographies in 4 languages: English, Arabic, French, and German, on just Arab families and youth, totaling almost 5,000 entries. These bibliographies are, by the way, available all online and accessible to all. Around the same time, she founded the Arab Families Group. She founded the UC Davis Arab Region Consortium that has currently 3 active projects: the Transforming Refugee Mental Health, Gendering STEM Education, and Mapping the Production of Knowledge on Women and Gender. All are collaborative, all are interdisciplinary, and all have scholars based in the region, Arab region, and the US. Joseph's penchant and strong preference towards collaboration and engagement can be found even locally at UC Davis, where she was the first social anthropologist to have a lab, a dry lab, no chemicals, chemical-free. The lab is for her research students to come together and to assist Joseph in her research. Although she is now retired, the lab continues to run with around 15 students working on her research project. It is a safe space for students to create community and friendships and to learn. They are all required to write and present research papers every year at the annual conference on Middle East and South Asia. She has set up an endowment in perpetuity at UC Davis, which awards research grants to undergraduate and graduate students in Middle East South Asian studies. She has also set up an endowment in perpetuity at the State University of New York at Cortland, where she got her undergraduate degree in social science. It was the only college close enough to home where she could still live with her family and get a degree. Joseph is deeply indebted to this liberal arts college, where professors took her under their wings and mentored her privately and directly because they saw the tremendous potential she had. She says, quote, "If it weren't for those professors, I would have ended up a high school teacher in the social science." Joseph writes that the need for safe spaces for survival and a series of historical moments compelled her to establish and build institutional spaces for knowledge production, especially for colleagues who produce contextualized knowledge about the region that takes seriously colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, racism, classism, sexism, Eurocentrism. There needs to be safe spaces. At the same time, it is difficult not to understand or interpret Joseph's collaborative, interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and transnational institution building as both feminist and kin-like, family-like. Feminist, as Joseph's institutional building is connected to broad-based social change. It's a way of giving back the communities and organizations with which she has worked. From UC Davis, the State University of New York at Cortland, to institutions in Lebanon and the region, and especially the Lebanon, the land of her birth, the home of her history, and the site of her scholarly research. Lebanon, the country she calls the cauldron of convergences. And equally, and perhaps more importantly, her institution building can be likened to kinship building, the bread and butter of anthropology. She is, after all, an anthropologist. In establishing and building institutions and endowments that have not only endured and survived, contributed to groundbreaking knowledge production within and about the region, but that also mimic the family. These institutions are sustainable structures that last through time beyond any single generation. And they are collaborative structures that entail mutuality, reciprocity, and the exchange of knowledge and care about the Arab region.
Thank you so much, Zeina. So we'll give you something like 10 minutes, just to reflect on what you heard, and then we will open the floor for the audience. Yeah. Unique. Like this. Yeah. Good.
Can I move this? Thank you. Which microphone am I speaking into? This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all very much for coming today, and thank you especially to my good friends. Thank you very much, my good friends Lydia Wick and Zeina Sowab, for this amazing discussion. I see so many friends in the room here. If I were to go around and acknowledge you all, that would take up my 10 minutes, but you know who you are, so thank you very much. But I do want to acknowledge one person, because Lydia mentioned that I do have a lab that's ongoing, and even though I'm retired, I still have students working in my lab, and there was one right there. Noor, who is studying for this semester at AUB, is in fact an intern in my lab, and will come back to the lab. He was the team lead for my New York Times media project, for which a book is out. It just come out. I haven't received my copy yet. So thank you, Noor, for both being at AUB and coming today. So living proof that there is indeed a lab. I won't comment too much, because I will be giving a keynote in a little while. But I do want to just reaffirm more than anything some of the things that both Dr. Wick and Dr. Sowab said, and if I may say Lydia and Zeina. It's absolutely true, and I will comment on it later, that I did not go out to study gender. Not only did I not go out to study gender, I wasn't a feminist. I was really not totally unaware of women as an issue. I was unaware that there was a difference between a male and a female head of household. In fact, I thought the household was a unit of action. as did most sociologists and anthropologists in the years that I was trained. And it was quite a shock to realize that men acted and thought differently than women, and that women had thoughts about the household and the neighborhood very differently from men and acted on those thoughts. So that was a wake-up call I had to think quite a lot about after I returned from my field work. I literally did not distinguish as I was taking notes. I just assumed they were all heads of household and that they would think the same. Livia is very astute to refer back to the article, The Eyes of Indirection. I've often said that my mother taught me more about doing field work than any anthropologist did, because she taught me to watch and to observe and to be very aware that there are 100 eyes watching me. How many of you heard that saying? You have 2 eyes, but there are 100 eyes watching you. That's how I grew up, looking around to see who was watching me. And then I learned to watch other people. And that was better fieldwork training than anything I got at Columbia. And it's certainly true that I grew up across multiple worlds, but I didn't know it at the time. It was only in reflecting back that I realized that not only was migration to the States a matter of coming into, I didn't know any English when we went. I was just literally dumped into the schools. I'd never been to school. I was 6, by the way, not 7. Give me back a year.
So please take your place. We will start again, and I am honored to have Suad for the part 2 here talk, and then it will be Q&A. So if you keep it in half an hour, it will be really great. Too late, yeah. Okay, so from connectivity to connectivity trauma, critical pathways engaging Arab families and Selving. You have the floor.
No. There are empty seats at the table. If anybody would join us, it's nice to see faces at the table. So feel free to join. I'd like to thank Dr. Saadi Hanafi for this kind invitation to participate in the Retrospectives of Arab Academics and Intellectuals series at the Center for Arab and Middle East Studies. It's truly an honor, Saadi, to be back at the American University of Beirut, which has been a kind of a home for me since 1968 when I first came as a student. And I'm especially grateful to Dr. Hanafi for offering me the opportunity to reflect on my work in ways that we often don't stop to reflect on our own work, as my good friend Iman was saying during the break. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Livia Wick and Dr. Zina Soab for the insightful and revelatory readings of my work. And I know that was a labor of love on your part. So thank you for the love and friendship, as you said. Dr. Hanafi asked me to include reflections upon my work on Arab family or families. And it made me think, what are the through lines of my research? Although almost all of my research has been on Lebanon, on the surface, it might look like I've been all over the map. But preparing for this lecture allowed me to ask what tied my work together and whether there were any through lines, and if so, what were they? As I regarded the work from the late 60s to the present, I did indeed find through lines that wove the body of the work together. One was a critique of the rational actor theory. Any of you who studied economics or political science will know that, and the Western notion of the person that is attached to that theory. This through line, which we'll talk about as we go, led me eventually to develop the notion of the relational or the connective self, patriarchal connectivity, relational rights, relational desire, relational intentionality, patriarchal connective mirroring, the control care paradigm. And it leads to my current work on trauma and STEM, which I'll talk about briefly. The other through line is about the nature and structure of the family, that such a relational self inhabits, and the nature of the state that fosters such family structures. This is a through line, again, we'll talk about all these, that links my critiques of political sectarianism, political familism, idiomatic kinship, the critique of the public-private binary, citizenship, civil rights, citizenship, civil society, rights, and the state. So those two through lines, which are basically about the family and the nature of the actor, I found when I thought about it, in almost every single project, and I'll try to weave that for you. Perhaps unlike so much else in my life, as you will see as I speak, it is not accidental that much of my research did focus on family and personhood. I grew up in a very close-knit family, as I mentioned earlier, the youngest of 7 children, with a huge family here. Literally, I personally know hundreds and hundreds, and I know there are thousands living, and with parents who dedicated their whole lives to their children. We struggled as working-class immigrants, and success came because of the time and the place we migrated to the United States, but success also came because we had an absolutely brilliant and visionary mother who, despite having no education herself, believed deeply in education and utterly committed herself to making sure that her children were educated. She dedicated herself to keeping her children together as a family, not allowed to fight. And if one person did something to the other, malish, khayik, malish, ikhtak. Yeah, I'm sure those words are familiar to you. It's to her, my mother, Mama Rose, that I owe everything. And I dedicate this lecture. I will, in this lecture, sketch out some genealogies of my work and some of the social, political, and intellectual context that stimulated my thinking and produced a string of conceptual interventions. But I will start by saying that in many ways, I am an accidental intellectual, an accidental anthropologist. I believe that I have backed into most of my academic career, maybe backed into most of my life, rather than planning with any foresight. I have not thought of myself as a scholar, but rather as a thinker and a problem solver. For those of you who want to look more into the ways in which these accidents shaped my research, the article God, Workers, Women, and Self, Convergences, Accidents, and Other Uncertainties in Half a Century of Fieldwork in Lebanon. Every time I see that word half a century, it bowls me over, which is an ethnologie française that I think Livia referenced. So I won't go into all of that. I was born in Lebanon, but my whole family moved to the United States, the state of New York, when I was a child before I'd begun school in Lebanon. But had there not been a branch of the State University of New York in my hometown, neither I nor my sister would have been allowed to leave home to go to college. Had it not been for young professors, I mentioned earlier, who mentored me in what was at that time an old normal school that only gave out teaching certificates and was not yet a liberal arts college when I started, I'd be an elementary school or a high school teacher. Had it not been for an elective course in anthropology my senior year in college, I might have ended up in literature. Had it not been for an accidental meeting at the University of Pittsburgh, where I spent 1 year, I would not have transferred to Columbia University for my PhD and probably would not have ended up studying Burj Hamid or even doing the kind of fieldwork that I did. I can go on and on. So many accidents, so little planning. And I knew so little of the world around me. My parents didn't know the world that they lived in. They couldn't mentor, they couldn't guide us. I mentioned these things to wave away any claim that I knew what I was doing when I began my career in my academic life. I did not. And also I mentioned them as a way of reaching out to early career scholars here to say, there are lives to be lived, and you can never know them until you live them. So go for it. Mine is one life, one journey that I am curious about. Not because my life or work are awesome in any regard, but because in some sense, in some ways, it is curious that it happened at all. A couple of general things I might say at the outset of my work and career. First, is that my thinking has been organized about problem solving. My work took the pathways that it did because I saw problems and something in me always pushes to find a solution. Don't come and talk to me about your problem because I'll try to problem solve them for you. Perhaps that's why I spent so much of my academic career founding or co-founding organizations. I saw needs and tried to build institutions or organizations that I thought would meet some of those needs. You can see the Cooking in the Cauldron article that Zina referenced about that kind of activity. Second, I've been very much oriented toward working collaboratively. Something in me does not like working alone. The fact that maybe because I had 7 brothers and sisters around me all the time, By the way, COVID taught me that I'm actually pretty good at spending time alone. The fact that I have a dozen or more edited or co-edited books and not one single authored book, not one single authored book. Not that I didn't have it in me. I love the collaboration so much. And some of you around this table have been part of these collaborations, but that's where where my tendencies took me. The third, and
you will not be promoted because no evidence of independent scholarship.
There you go. Neither at the University of California, Davis, I may say. Third, and I think that's already been alluded to by both of my good friends and colleagues, is that my thinking is relational, contextual. I did not have the vocabulary to describe it in that way in the late 1990s. And it is perhaps because of this relationality that I understand my own work largely in the context of the social, political, and intellectual historical moments and historical locations that I was privileged to live in. So first, what were those historical moments and those historical locations? Some of those absolutely momentous historical conjunctures that I was privileged to live through, the student strikes of the 1960s that became global, the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement that became global, the civil rights movement that was foundational to what America became, the women's movement that became global, the 1967 Arab-Israeli war that opened my eyes, the Lebanese civil war that terrified all of us, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the first and the second Palestinian intifadas, 87 to 93, then 2000 to 2005, the women of color movement that became global, the people of color movement, the post-colonial movements that became, the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the bipolar world in 1991, the first Gulf War, 1990-91, the September 11, 2001 events and their aftermath, the war on Iraq, the war on terror, the intensification and expansion of Islamophobia globally, Black Lives Matter, and so much more. It was a profound period of time, historically momentous, I believe. And these momentous historical conjunctures contributed to the emergence of feminist theory, critical race theory, decolonial theory, and so on. And I was privileged to be in that period of time when these things were emerging and happening. And some of the historical locations, it's not simply the time, but also where you are. I was privileged to find myself in New York City at Columbia University in the turbulent 60s and 70s. Almost every movement and every person passed through New York City at some point in time during this era. My mother used to say to me, it's a good thing you have so many friends coming to visit you because then I know you'll clean your house because everybody came through New York. I returned to Lebanon in 1968 and again in 71 and 73, and I caught that last glimmer of Dahabi. I saw Lebanon before the Civil War, and I feel so sad for anyone who didn't know the possibility, the promise of what we thought Lebanon was going to become in the late 60s and early 70s. And I moved to California in the mid 70s, and California was the epicenter of so much of American progressive politics during that period of time. I joined the generation of second wave feminisms in the 1970s as it was emerging, as it was beginning, as it was entering academia. I was among that very first early wave of working class women who entered the academy in the 1970s. And I connected with scholars who were beginning the launching of the critiques of STEM, of psychology, of history, of anthropology, many of whom were in or passed through Northern California, which is where I lived. And my location in the academy gave me the luxury of becoming an academic and teaching courses as a way to teach myself about critical issues and approaches as they were emerging nationally and internationally. I wanted to understand something, I'd teach a course on it so that I would read and learn with the students. It is perhaps these moments, these locations, these orientations toward problem solving, collaboration, relationality, in addition to my own family experience, that led me eventually to studying Arab families and personhood, as well as, and I'll touch later briefly on the STEM and the trauma projects. Today, I will talk perhaps more about these social, political, intellectual contexts, as I will as about my research on Arab families and personhood, because I believe so strongly that we are temporal, transitory products of our locations. Our thinking, our analyses, our insights are shaped by the accidents of time, place, people. I claim no credit for the outcome of these accidents. The little credit that I can claim is in recognizing the privileges that I have lived in the places where I have lived, the time that I have lived in, and the people with whom I have lived. That's the claim I make. So an invitation to you all on Zoom, if you're still there, hopefully it's a little bit later in the day, wherever you are. I've spent 45, what I would say, restless years thinking about, writing about, theorizing Arab families and personhood. The journey has been driven by and through personal, temporal, locational, political, social, and intellectual trajectories. My research has covered the state, politicization of religion, the critique of political sectarianism, class, social networks, WASTA, local level communities, NGOs, citizenship rights, civil society, nationhood, women's movements, social organization, education and school systems, transnational migration, refugees, self and personhood, and other topics, mostly in this very beloved country we call Lebanon. But in a very peculiar way, all of those projects led me back to family and to personhood. Most recently, I'm engaged in 3 projects through the University of California, Davis Arab region, which has already been referenced. And I'd love to say, I want to mention that AUB co-hosted with LAU the very first meeting of this consortium here in 2001. I'll talk on, since we had quite a bit on the mapping the production of knowledge project. I'll talk about 2 later on. One is the trauma project, and one is a project on foundational concept of STEM. And Lydia is a member of the STEM project. We don't think we have anybody here from the trauma project, but we have colleagues here at AUB and LAU from it. Both of these, they're very different projects, very different disciplines, and yet both of them, I can see now the resonances of family and personhood as a through line through them. So today I want to invite you to join me in a journey of reflection on how I stumbled onto the field of family and personhood studies, and how each stumbling step pushed me into another series of engagements. Each new engagement, each new question presented itself as a problem that needed solutions that had what appeared to me to be logical organic connections with prior questions. And my thinking just snowballed, almost out of my own control, propelling me along a pathway that led in some ways what appeared to be logically and organically to my current projects on STEM and trauma. So the context, journey to Arab families and personhood. As with some other radical projects, my journey towards studying Arab families and self started with a revolutionary historical moment that included the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the global 1968 student strikes, the anti-Vietnam War movements, the civil rights movements, and the women's movements. I was a graduate student for 1 year only at the University of Pittsburgh at the time of the 1967 war. When the defeat of the Arab coalition became apparent, I remember standing just outside the University of Pittsburgh main building talking to a friend when a young Jewish fellow student joined us. She looked pointedly at me and said, "I'm wearing my victory shoes." The remark appeared to be directed at me, but I didn't understand it. I was apolitical, or at least very politically naive. I had not grown up in a political family. I transferred to do graduate work at Columbia University in the fall of 1967, and very shortly, within a few months after, the student strikes began. It was an utterly momentous historical moment for New York, for the country, and in some ways for the world, because there were student strikes all over the world, and they're wonderful documentaries. If you're not aware of that period of time, that I'd really encourage you to take a look at, because it was a global phenomenon, but it was accidental timing. I didn't know there was going to be a strike at Columbia, and I didn't know that was going to completely transform my life, but it did. Accidents. The anthropology department at Columbia was relatively progressive and supported the strike. And at Columbia was one of the 2 most radical strikes in the country, the other one being at UC Berkeley. And the reason Columbia was such a radical strike was that it joined with the Black students from Harlem, Columbia, for those who don't know, borders on Harlem. I won't go into the reasons for the strike and why Harlem was so involved, but you can read about it. And I gravitated toward the most radical of my peers, the Marxist graduate students. The readings, the seminars, the work we did together, some of which I've written about in other papers, resonated with my own working class background, and there were other awakenings. I remember standing in the anthropology office talking to a professor when one of the secretaries rather loudly said to this professor, "How can you talk to her? She's an Arab." And I thought, this is curious. I didn't know where to place these things because, again, I was rather politically naive. I came to Lebanon in the summer of 1968 to investigate the possibilities for my research. The fortuitous circumstances of my coming as a YWCA camp counselor as a way to pay for my trip connected me with two of the people who would be the most formative of my relationships in Lebanon, Mary Farha and Mary Hani. Accidents. I came back to Lebanon in 1971 to 73 to study the politicization of religion and to look for an urban setting for my fieldwork. Urban anthropology was a relatively new field at that time. Anthropology up to that point mainly studied peasants and tribal groups and rural settings. I believe I was the first social anthropologist at Columbia to do doctoral exams in urban anthropology. We had to scrounge to find material for me to do the exams. Then I found myself in Burj Hammoud mainly because of another accident. My friend Mary Farha, who was a good friend by then, had found an apartment for me that I could rent there. Accidents. Burj Hammoud led me to consider the intersections of class, religion, and political pluralism. Coming from a very devout Catholic family, I had become critical of institutional Catholicism. I emphasize institutional Catholicism as a young teenager. Later, that emergent critique of institutionalized religion joined with work I had done a year earlier on political pluralism in Malaysia. Those institutions can then really be injected with a politics that can be deadly. The joint critique of institutionalized religion and political pluralism, which took the form of sectarianism in Lebanon, intersected with my readings in Marxism in graduate and undergraduate school. Lebanon was an ideal for investigating these intersections, especially in the early 1970s. My first critique of sectarianism and pluralism in Lebanon was a paper I presented as a graduate student in 1969 called Pluralism, Tool of Imperialism, which pretty much said everything about my rather very instrumental understanding of Marxism at the time. I had intended to do fieldwork in a factory with workers from different religious sects. But failing to find an appropriate factory setting, I ended up in Camp Trad neighborhood of Burj Hammoud. Accidents. An apartment that I could rent. Burj Hammoud transformed my project from factory to family. Still, though, at the intersections of class, religion, and political pluralism, my doctoral research was grounded in ethnographic work located in house-to-house relationships in a highly diverse working-class neighborhood of Lebanese and Palestinians and Syrians and Egyptians and Jordanians of all religious sects. I argued in my dissertation in 1975 that proximity was the critical factor in relationships and values at the local level, but that when local people were pulled into national politics, politicized sectarianism rechanneled their actions and their alignments. I argued that heterogeneous neighborhoods like Camp Trad were dangerous for the political elite because the values and relationalities that were emerging undermined political sectarianism. So it was not surprising to me that one of the political projects of the 1975 Civil War, for those of you who remember, was actually to rearrange political demographies. People were being pulled out of neighborhoods and moved to other neighborhoods. Most relevant, however, to my trajectory of doing research on family and personhood that came out of the 68 trip and then the 71 to 73 fieldwork was the personal awakening to the kinds of relationalities that were possible in Lebanon that I had not experienced in the United States. In Camp Trad, I immersed myself in street-based relationships. I spent an average of 10 hours per household, interviewing over 100 households, and endless hours visiting, being visited, pulled into neighborhood dynamics with an intensity I had only ever experienced within my own family. And slipping into these relationships was, I thought, an anthropological method. That's what you're supposed to do as an anthropology, create relationships, and those relationships provide you with data, right? But it was more. It was familiar. I knew organically what to do. Columbia didn't teach me what to do in those relationships. My mother taught me what to do in those relationships. I knew what to do. It was easy, recognizable, familiar, because the relationships I developed in Burj Hammoud were very much like relationships I had been socialized to develop in my family. I did not think about or theorize those relationships. I thought I was just doing anthropology. I normalized them. I naturalized them. I thought of the relationships as good fieldwork methods. I thought I was a good ethnographer, building trust in relationships that were data-filled. I did not know then that those relationships would provoke a lifetime of thinking and theorizing family and personhood accidents. The Journey to Arab Families and Personhood launched. The first step to rethinking those relationships and their dynamics started after I returned to Columbia University. Returning to New York in 1973, after 2.5 years of fieldwork, I had begun teaching at Hofstra University in anthropology based on an agreement with the chair that I would teach a course in anthropology of education. I knew nothing about anthropology and education. I asked colleagues to guide me to resources so I could teach anthropology of education. It hardly existed as a field in 1973. And within a year of being there, my department chair asked me to teach a course on sex roles. He'd heard about it and thought that would boost enrollments. I knew nothing about sex roles. I was not a feminist. I had never done gender studies. So I asked colleagues to guide me in the literature about sex roles, which in 1974 was just coming into the academy as a field. So teaching anthropology of education quickly led me to psychology because it seemed to me that this emerging field of anthropology was really built on psychological theory. And when I moved to UC Davis in 1976, I stopped teaching anthropology of education and developed a series of courses on psychological anthropology that I taught for decades. These courses immersed me in the timing, look at this, in the emerging fields of cross-cultural psychiatry and feminist rethinking of psychoanalysis. The field just burst wide open in the 70s of feminists going back and rethinking psychoanalysis. And there I was teaching this course. And made me think about the notions of self and personhood. Teaching sex roles at Hofstra University and continuing to develop women's studies courses at UC Davis introduced me to yet another emerging field in anthropology. I was one of the co-founders of the Women's Studies program at UCD in 1980 and developed and taught new courses constantly. This launched me into transnational feminist theorizing, women of color theorizing, intersectional theory, feminist critiques of STEM. Much of the early second wave of feminist theorizing, in fact, for those of you who were there at the time or want to go back to it, much of that early feminist theory was actually about the family and women in the family and about motherhood, book after book about mothers. And I read it intently, and it pushed me further to thinking about Burj Hammoud and the data that I had, as Olivia rightly pointed, rethinking my data. Immersion in the newly emerging feminist literature was partly propelled by the fact that I had already been mulling over my own data from Camp Trud that was, to my surprise, inhabited largely by women. I had more data about women than anybody else, and I didn't know it at the time. In effect, teaching psychological anthropology and women's studies taught me about those fields, and I grounded my teaching over many decades of those courses in the emerging critiques of Orientalism and the counter critiques as well, critiques of positivism, feminist critiques of psychoanalysis, Marxist feminism, women of color feminism, feminist critiques of liberal feminism, transnational feminism, subaltern studies, post-colonial theory, critical race theory, decolonial theory, and so forth. Teaching was my way of learning. I taught those, I assigned myself books that I myself had not read in order to be able to read them and think them through. Beginning to write. The decade immediately after my return to New York City from fieldwork in 1973 was focused overwhelmingly on my work on the politicization of religion and the Lebanese War, which had just broken out in 1975.
On behalf of the organizer, we have a question we ask all the seventh, and you are the eighth. Question whether in your trajectory you wrote something that you regretted, or you took a path, I don't know, theoretical path, something, and then you feel that you should have thought differently and things like that. Yeah.
Let me answer Saudi first. All of it I regret. Can I start all over again? Seriously, though, let me go back to Kirsten's first question. It goes back to, I don't know if you've looked at some of the more recent articles. In almost every article, I spent some time talking about the concept of categorical thinking. In fact, I have maybe 3 or 4 articles where I spend time, because it's something that's compelling. My very last course I taught at UC Davis, the whole syllabus was organized around a critique of categorical thinking. Everything we do is categorical. Every word we utter is categorical. The mind is organized, I've come to believe, to turn things into categories. Language always turns things to categories. But if you don't see the word categorically, how do you speak? And that's my dilemma, because I don't see the world categorically. And it could be, as Lydia said, that I never fit any particular place. So the boundaries were always fuzzy. And I've never quite understood boundaries. I've never quite understood why something starts here and something else stops there, whether it's a nation or a class or a religious community or a person or a plant or an animal. I think all of us would agree that categories are artificial. Even the biologists recognize that their categories are artificial, and they're constantly trying to reassess them. You know, is a bush always a bush? Is a tree always a tree? No, these are artificial categories, and they know that. Yet they spend their entire careers putting things into categories and inventing new ones when the others fail us, right? We are the categories that we live. And yet we're always struggling because none of them fit. Whether it's a term like patriarchal connectivity, or whether it's a term like the self, or whether it's a term like articulation. The term articulation in and of itself implies that there's a there that comes together. And that in itself has always been a problematic for me. I don't see a there in maleness. I don't see a there in femaleness. So how do we then ascribe something to the male or the masculinity or the or femininity? And then how do we develop a language that tells us that the there-ness is overwhelmingly conceptually articulated, to use your term, in order to allow for certain kinds of interventions, and that the more complex the state, the more complex the kind of society we have, the more complex are the categories that we invent, and the more we inhabit them, and the more they differentiate them, because the very purpose, the lived purpose of categories is to differentiate, to create difference, to say this is this and not that. That's what categories are. So for me, coming up with terms like any of the terms that was always a problem. Language is a problem. You can think things you cannot say, but then how do you communicate them? How do you even think them? And so I think there's a struggle for us who have a recognition of the historical moment that we are a part of, a struggle for the recognition with the recognition that that historical moment not only organizes us with these temporal categories, but inhibits us from imagining what is possible beyond those categories, and then we make it a lifetime of imagining beyond these categories. And that's what makes for revolutionaries, is that you're always trying to imagine beyond the categories. So you've got the whole field of sexualities, for example. It's constant imagination beyond the categories that we had 50 years ago or 30 years ago and still have. Or the critical race theory, imagining other kinds of categories. I'm not satisfied with a single term I've created, because every single term locks us into a category. The care control paradigm, the kin contract, idiomatic kinship, political familism, you name it. They're, at best, they capture a transitory thing. At best, they capture a temporal phenomena. At best, They give us something to talk about as it moves away from what we're talking about. And so the struggle for me always is to tell the world, stand still for a minute so I can see you, because I want to see you. And yet knowing fully well that the fluidity of life, the fluidity of the world will not stand still. And the most that we can do is to intervene at certain moments, knowing that we've only captured, that we have sliced into something that will not allow us to slice into it, because it moves as soon as we slice into it. And as soon as we freeze it with some kind of a form that it is not, it no longer is. We are no longer truthful to even that moment where we were slicing it into it. So I was not being facetious when I said to Saudi, I take it all back, because I was always aware that these were momentary interventions. And yet there was a propulsion to try to know, a propulsion to try to understand, a propulsion to try to communicate, and a propulsion to come up with some kind of tools to solve the problems that I lived and experienced. And those tools needed to have a vocabulary. So I don't know, that's totally unsatisfying, I'm sure, but it's the life I live and the reality I live within, which is to see everything around me as fluid, messy, transitory, and utterly exciting and scintillating and marvelous and magical at the same time. Rabia, good luck. Thank you for trying. I hope it helped. Hassan, about home economics. I am of that generation that was required to take a home economics class. So I very much understand it. While the boys were out doing shop, we were learning how to sew and cook and so forth. But for me, what was interesting about what I was trying to do as a critique, and I'll mention it briefly in my keynote, as a critique of what feminist psychoanalysts were doing and feminist theory was trying to do, was to say, there's a feminist morality and there's a masculine morality, or that women are relational and men are not. Was to say, that's not what I find here. I find men to be as relational as women. And my patriarchal connectivity was about saying this applies to men too. So home economics is about politics. It's about life. It's about the state. I don't see those kind of divisions that we inherited when we divided up society into the state, civil society, and the private, or the private and the public. Those never made sense to me. They still don't make sense, because I see politics everywhere. I see the family everywhere. I see relationality everywhere. It just has different vocabularies in different sites. And some of those vocabularies make it seem as if it's illegal, but they do it anyway. So for me, those. Okay. I am now.
Yeah. Can you take one the speakers, please? Yeah.
Suad, and thank you so much for your response to the responses. What do you call the interventions at the beginning? I mean, everything is just, it's making me think a lot. And I'm so happy we get to see you here in Beirut this week. And I wanted to say that I know that you're a mentor to so many, whether you know them or not, whether through your work, your scholarship, or through the many, many projects that Zina was talking about. And you make things possible for people, and your energy is, I mean, with our project, I feel like, yes, for the last few years, You've been the one pushing and pulling and constantly pulling us forward. So like transcontinental kind of energy that you emit. But what I wanted to ask you is who made things possible for you, and who were your mentors?
A lovely question.
Yes.
Thank you. My teachers, first and foremost, my mother, and I'll have a comment about her in a minute. First and foremost, and to the end, my mother, the most brilliant person I've ever met in my life, the wisest person I've ever met in my life, the most caring and loving and giving person I've met in my life. And I'll start crying in a minute if I don't stop. So, but I was very fortunate. My whole family was very fortunate. I do not talk about this in detail in this particular lecture that you'll be hearing. But we moved to the United States at a time when the United States welcomed immigrants. They do not now, as you well know. The borders are closed. It's very difficult. Even when the Syrian catastrophe happened, the United States only agreed to accept 10,000 Syrian refugees, and they didn't even accept 10,000. So it's not a country that welcomes immigrants now, but it did in the 50s when we went there. And we went to a small town, which was a place that welcomed immigrants. And all the way through our school system, we had teachers who, not only for me, but for our whole family, they saw in us some potential, some promise. And every single one of my brothers and sisters and myself, some teachers took us aside under their wing and pushed us along. My fifth grade teacher, my 10th grade teacher, I could name them all. I could tell you stories about them all. But ultimately, what the person who probably most, and unbeknownst to me as to what he was doing, was in my freshman year a young Jewish sociology professor who called me into his office and said, take the midterm exam and come back and see me after the midterm. I took the midterm exam, went back to see him, and he said, okay, I'm going to give you an automatic A. You don't have to go to class anymore. And from now on, you're doing individual readings with me. I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he was my teacher, so I had to do what he told me. He mentored me for 2 years like that. For 2 years, he gave me individual reading classes. And then a history professor who happened to also be a young Jewish historian did the same thing. You're going to take reading classes with me. Then an economist did the same thing. I don't know why they did that, but without my being known, without my...
Don't know, but you know.
But I was blessed. I was blessed to have people who kind of went out of their way for whatever reason. And that's why I think we have to pay back, because I wouldn't be here today. My whole family, I'll tell you just a little brief story. I am blessed to have utterly brilliant brothers and sisters. My oldest brother was 16 when we came to the United States. He didn't know any English. He knew French, of course, because we went to French schools. And he was put into, he put himself into class and did 4 years of high school in 3 years. And it was during the Korean War. And the teachers and the principal went to the draft board and persuaded the draft board. They said, you cannot send this boy to Korea. He's got to go to college. They persuaded the draft board not to draft him. He didn't know. None of us knew. Years later, the daughter of the woman who was the chair of the draft board told him that the principal and the teachers had gone to her and told him not to draft him because they insisted that he go to college. Where was he going to go to college? My father's highest earning ever was $5,000 in 1 year. My mother's highest earning ever was $3,000 in 1 year. We were a family of 9. The teachers went around to the businessmen in town. They raised money and they sent my brother to his first year in college, Union College. They did the same thing for my second brother. How do you pay back? What do you do when you feel like you have had so many gifts that weren't in the life plan, if you were to say? So each of us had people along the way who just went out of their way for us. We were blessed, we were lucky, and we have responsibility. Anyone who's blessed, let me put it a different way. I remember my mother, who, as I've said to many of you who know me personally, never had the opportunity for education. She was an orphan. She was put to work in a cigarette factory at the age of 6 or 7, rolling cigarettes. to the day she died, she could tell you exactly how many cigarettes she rolled a day. And we didn't have much, you know, a family of 9 with an income of $8,000 a year. We all worked. There was this old woman who's a little bit kind of off, not quite mentally all there, who helped my mom around the house when my mom was working full time. And the kids on the street would always tease her, throw things at her because she was clearly, not quite right. But whenever she would come, when mom no longer needed her to help around the house, she would still come. We called her old Bessie. Bessie would come and visit my mom. And whenever Bessie came, mom would sit with her, give her a cup of coffee, cake, or whatever she had. And when Bessie was ready to leave, mom would have a bag for her and send it to her. That was a whole meal. And I asked her once, why are you doing that, Mom? It's not like we have so much. And she said, whatever we have, she has less. And that was, for me, a life lesson. Whatever we have, there's somebody who has less, whether it's intellectually or financially or friendship circles, I don't know. I just feel that we all have, and maybe this is tied up with my notion of relationality, is that life is about relationships. You know, work is about relationships. I mean, it's been an utter pleasure working with you, Suad. I mean, I literally chased after you at Mesa, remember, because you disappeared on me for a couple of years for the mapping project. I ran after her for 3 days at the Middle East Studies Association meetings until I got her to sit down and said, are you going to do this or are you not? She said, yes, yes, I'll do it. But it's been a pleasure having you in that project.
Yeah, we still have the second part. So let's take 15 minutes of break and come back. We have a coffee break outside. Just thank you so much, Suad, Livia, and Zina.